In this episode, I need some help with my sci-fi campaign, so I asked Mike back to guide me through creating a space age campaign in some easy steps. Welcome to the Mythras Matters podcast, Season 1, Episode 71, Creating a Sci-Fi Campaign, starting with strong foundations. Hello and welcome to Mythras Matters, a podcast dedicated to the Mythras rule set and all its supplements. As always, I'm your host, Inwils, and welcome to July. Wow, what a busy month. So many things happening in the realm of Mythras. After last month's podcast episode, is anyone else really looking forward to the Greymere Gazetteer? I will be moving my own classic fantasy campaign into Greymere as soon as I can lay hands on the publication. And talking about classic fantasy, we have 2 new members joining our group this weekend. This is fantastic news. I hope they enjoy it. And having a party of 6 somehow feels more RPG-like. When I was just starting out with RPG games, I used to create a whole party and adventure down the dungeons. In those days, the dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons really did mean dungeons. So many long nights exploring hidden depths and getting very excited when I found the steps to the 2nd level. I think I still have my first dungeon somewhere. It had several layers and a dragon lair at the lowest level. With a party of 6, I always remember the marching order. Small races at the front with melee weapons, 2nd row with missile weapons so they could fire over the heads of the front row, then the low hit-pointed magic users, and the thieves bringing up the rear ready to slip into the shadows when needed. I also remember that if we went into a room, the monsters were shared equally between the party, so my spellcasters were always faced with an armed goblin with only their daggers and darts, wearing no armor and 1d4 worth of hit points, and not really wanting to use their only spell. Yes, in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the magic users had 1 spell at 1st level, and that was it. So really, Burning Hand, Sleep, or Magic Missile. Oh, those were the days. One thing I find particularly challenging as an individual is interacting with new people. Call it social anxiety or whatever you want to call it, but I've decided to push myself. I was lucky and had a group of willing people who wanted to play Mythras, but I know that there might be people out there who want to try the system but will have no one to run a session for them. Well, I had added a post in the excellent Discord and offered to run a one-off adventure for people who haven't played Mythras before. We are currently creating characters and looking for a date and time when we can play. But I'm hoping if this one goes well, then I can make it a regular thing and GM for more players and other campaign settings as well. You will probably hear how it went in the Discord. I've always wanted to have a sci-fi campaign, but I am constantly put off by the vastness of the possible universe. and how to create an atmosphere that I like and matches those great films such as Star Wars and Firefly. Having read the adventure called The Triton Incident, based in Elevation campaign setting, I thought I would ask its creator for some ideas for creating a sci-fi campaign.
Sure. My name is Mike Larimore. I am the author of Destined, and I'm the author of Elevation. In the background, you hear Josephine, my dog. So I
Fantastic.
apologize in advance. And I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm a key. I love M space, but as the GM, I am almost like tasked to create this universe where the players are going to actually explore and adventure. And I really have little idea where to start. So I know you did Elevation, and we also chatted about cities earlier on. So I thought you would be the perfect person to talk about setting up a sci-fi campaign world. So what's the first thing that I need to think about?
I think the very first question is going to be what style of science fiction. We look at a genre and it's more than just one thing. Fantasy. Fantasy can be low fantasy, it can be sword and sorcery, it can be high fantasy, and science fiction, because it covers the breadth of so much stuff. You have Star Wars. How you have space opera. You have speculative science fiction, which asks the deeper questions about things. You have cyberpunk, which if you play the excellent Cyberpunk 2077, it kind of, and Shadowrun for those of us, in role-playing games. You have horror science fiction, if you look at Aliens, or if you look at the Dead Space video games. So, I mean, it covers so much. It's kind of tricky to kind of decide, but I think that if you come up with the genre, it'll start to influence and inspire. It'll give you ideas, and it's stealing from your darlings. It's the idea of take a movie, take a book, take a comic book, take a video game that you really enjoy, and use it as a basis. It can really help that process to kind of, are you going to just take it wholesale and kind of, oh yes, it's a science fiction setting where there are space knights with laser swords, and it's purely original, or are you going to, for example, Elevation is the Elevation book came from some previous science fiction campaigns I run over the years. A failed children's television show pilot pitch, and a big part of it was, the question of what if the Federation in Star Trek was broke?
Oh, nice.
These giant peacekeeping organizations that you see so many shows, and what happens if it doesn't work out? People don't want, I not to be nihilistic, but it kind of feels sometimes the more realistic, take on science fiction would be giant corporations, and, aliens aren't going to be soft and fuzzy. It's not necessarily going to be a really fun setting, but it was just that kind of idea. And I think that's where you start. And from there, you can also decide on, what's the scale and scope of your world, because I think that is a hard thing too. In Destined, the scope is generally Gemelos City.
Yes.
It can go beyond that, but that's kind of the superhero. Batman has Gotham City, Superman has Metropolis, Spider-Man's New York. A lot of fantasy settings, sometimes you don't really leave that one town or village. How many people kind of don't leave Waterdeep or don't leave, Greyhawk if they're playing a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. You might venture out a little bit past the barriers of your homeland, but you still stay close to home.
Return. Yeah.
Even in science fiction, Cyberpunk is a great example. If you're playing, the Cyberpunk role-playing game, or you're playing the video game, it's all in Night City. That's
Yes.
where the whole thing takes place. So even science fiction can be limited, but then you have things like Doctor Who, where it's all of time and space. You have dimensional travel. You have galaxies upon galaxies to explore, and solar systems to map out, and the vastness of space, and that can be intimidating. But
100%. And I think that's something that I'm struggling with at the moment. It's sort of like the vastness of it. How is it a case that I need to create a whole subsector or sector of planets and galaxies, or is there a better way to approach it?
I think it depends on your group. Let's take an example of one of our oldest science fiction role-playing games, Traveller. Travelers had decades and decades, of things, people building upon it. Some people here actually have written a Traveller adventure, so we added our own little piece to it. It's one of those things that people, dozens and dozens of people over the years, and authors have added and added and added. And if you actually look at the galaxy map of the setting of Traveller, the Imperium, it's massive.
I used to have that as a poster. I'm sure of it. Yeah.
A giant hex map full of little colored dots with all kinds of different planets. And that's great. But in the scope of any kind of role-playing campaign, how much of that are you really going to explore? I like to think of it more in the line of something like Firefly or Star Trek,
Yes.
where you have to view it in a lot of ways as it's episodic. Your characters may never get off the planet you start them on. They may never, and if they're fine with that, they're having fun, that's fine. If they want to go explore the galaxy, there's lots of great ideas in terms of hex crawls that you can do with galaxy exploration, or just, you end up on X planet that, Ian has sat down and prepared and come up with a couple notes, and that's where they end up. That I think that's kind of a lot of times is that, depending on your group, someone might enjoy the idea of calculating every liter of fuel in their fuel tanks, and mapping out every planet, even if it has no valuable resources or can sustain life. But I think a lot of groups, they want the planet where the space pirates are. They want the planet where the evil space empire is doing something terrible to the people there, and they could be the heroes. They want those stories. And I think that's really, it's that in that way, it seems vast, but when you really break it down, it's another dungeon crawl. It's another, save the people in peril story. It's another, Seven Samurai, story where the player characters swoop in against overwhelming odds and manage to, win the day.
And victorious, they leave as well, slightly battered.
Yeah.
I love the idea of starship and starship combats and spaceships and everything like that. So I think I would want them to travel, but I think what I'm understanding is that we can work out where they're traveling to and just make that part of the story arc. And, my players are good. If I said you're going to that place, they're not likely to say, oh, we'll turn left, and go somewhere else.
Well, and I know there's so many resources out there now in terms of random tables, random adventure generators. If you want to use like AI learning models to come up with things that even on the fly, you say we're going to go to planet X and they decide to go to planet Y. That's like, okay, then, what's there? What's interesting? What's new?
Yes.
And I think it's really the question of scale and scope is one that it is what we make it.
Definitely. Yeah.
There is
a generator, isn't there, for random planets and everything like that. I'm sure there is.
M-Space has a lot of those things, already built in, which I think is one of the great resources of it. I'm not to talk about games outside of our Mythras sphere, but Stars Without Numbers is a good example that has a lot of tables and generation systems for plants as well. And that's what I mean. Like, there are resources out there, especially now because we have so many things online, that you can generate a map for a planet, in a couple keystrokes.
Yeah. I think it's Don John. I don't know if you know that site.
Yes.
It'll actually virtually create a world, instantaneously for you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that'd be really helpful. But I like this idea of starting quite small and then building it up from there.
The micro to the macro. I think that's one of those things that is a really great thing in any kind of campaign, no matter what genre you're playing. But I think especially science fiction, because it can feel overwhelming. And even what you said before, it's one of those things I think we don't always think about when it comes to science fiction. But you said about starship combat. That's something I think it was a game master we always have to be careful with, because we think of the Millennium Falcon, we think of the Enterprise, we think of these ships that are the focus of a character or become a character in and of themselves in something that we enjoy, and they also have plot armor. So it doesn't matter how many TIE fighters you throw at the Millennium Falcon, it's not going to blow up and kill Han Solo and Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker, and then the story of Star Wars is over in 10 minutes. No matter what they throw at them. But as we know with player characters, that doesn't always happen.
100%. Yeah.
I remember playing the old West End game Star Wars, and one of my players in their stock light freighters, seeing a Star Destroyer coming out of orbit and saying, "All right, let's take them." And I thought, oh, this is gonna be a short campaign.
Yeah.
But it's something I think we always have to consider, when we're introducing that too, is the potential of one thing that can end a science fiction campaign really quickly is one stray plasma battery blast.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's always something to consider when you're putting that in, is how are you going to handle when they lose? Is it going to be something they survive, or is it going to be something that, okay, well, we're open to characters because
get to the escape pods.
Yeah.
So if you look at the classic sci-fi films or settings, we always have aliens, like in Star Trek or, with Star Wars, we always have these aliens. So what's your advice about humanity in general in the universe or in our campaign?
Well, we always make it human-centric because we're humans. The Federation is a human-devised organization, even though a lot of other alien species have joined it. We follow mostly human characters in Star Wars. Babylon 5 was, humans primarily, but alien species there. And I think that's kind of what we've gotten used to. Most of our aliens in science fiction media are also humanoid, because it's cheaper to put a couple prosthetics and a little, little makeup on somebody than to come up with some kind of strange alien beast. I always think of, the first time you see the Martians in the old classic War of the Worlds movie, and they're not human. They're kind of blobby and slug-like, and it's alien to us, and I think that is kind of uncomfortable. And why you see, like, in more horror themed things, the aliens usually aren't. They're quite opposite of human, or they're humanoid, but in such an alien way that it's frightening to us. So I think if you're introducing aliens, you have to kind of decide: is it something where they're comfortable and familiar? Is it something that the characters can relate to? Are they something completely alien? That makes it where the players might not know how to deal with it, which I think could be a very interesting thing, where, what the aliens don't have a common language with you, or the aliens don't function the same way we do. So how do you deal with them? How do you communicate with them? How do you process it? And that can really become a whole thing of itself. Or we can just do the classic thing that we love is, there's just a big mix of aliens, whatever you can get from your Spirit Halloween store or whatever you have in the equivalent of England, of masks and costumes, and put them in the cantina somewhere. And that it's just this great melting pot of species from all over the galaxy. Or, I know that question came up with Elevation, is how many? If you go by
Yeah.
things like the Drake equation, they talk about what is the chance of there being other life, and it's not great. It's not like a Star Wars where there's going to be 18 million different species hanging out in the galaxy. It's probably pretty limited. So I kind of limited the amount, but or do you do something like Firefly where there aren't any aliens, period. There's
Yeah.
just humans. That can be its own question. Is there alien life? Is that the point of the campaign, to discover it, to find it? Are we going to like it when we find it? Or are we just, it's just so ubiquitous in the campaign that we don't even think about it. That guy across the bar from us, who has a head on top of a big stalk and, 18 arms. He's just
Yeah.
Bob. It's just something where, we don't. And I think that makes it fun because, or are the players allowed to play aliens? Is this something where, I could think of every Star Wars campaign that I ever ran where somebody said, I'm going to play the Wookiee.
Yes.
And you think, okay, are we going to have the campaign where they're just going to go the whole time and write notes? Or are we just going to ignore it? It can make for interesting role-playing experiences, but it also can be something where you have to really decide. Or do they have their own agenda as part of an alien species? Do they have their own goals and interests and motivations that are different from the other characters? I think it can add a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah. I must admit, I like human campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I started to play Mythras as it was that there wasn't this race choice,
Mm-hmm.
so because I don't mind elves, dwarves, but I just think darkness is so scary for humans.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But once you've got somebody with infravision or dark
Yeah.
vision, it's just sort of like it's completely changed. And
Yeah.
I think I think I probably want aliens to be there, but it may be some kind of alien planet that
Mm-hmm.
they are completely suited to. Well, the player characters may not be. So there's something quite. It sounds as if it would be dangerous to. Well, they wouldn't be on equal terms because they're used to that high amount of gravity or that poisonous atmosphere. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question in and of itself. Is just the biological differences. We understand life for what it is because it's a life that we've experienced and what we know. We don't know what other things can be out there. It's that question we have now, in terms of like AI and, language learning models is, when does something is even classified as life,
Yes.
in terms of sentience and consciousness. So that can be an interesting thing. Or like you said, that's a challenge right there. If biologically, your human characters need to wear special, suits and special things to survive when they're dealing with alien species because they don't breathe the same kind of air that we do, or the gravity is so much more intense, or, there's a level of radiation that they have grown tolerant to but would kill us. I think those are interesting things too. And they're challenges that you can introduce into your, they have to think, how am I going to deal with this situation that doesn't involve, a blaster pistol and, my fists and my wit.
Yes. And I think I like that in the campaign, that how are we going to deal with this interaction? We talked a lot about aliens, and I want to talk about travel. But just as we move there, the other thing that I have a trouble with is how to pitch the level of technology. And I was just thinking when we were talking about aliens and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with Babel Fish, that instantly translates.
Yes.
What would you recommend when looking at technology or space travel and things like that?
I think it's a matter of what challenges you want your players to face. It's a case of, a Babel fish is a great example in terms of, do you want to have to worry about alien languages, or do you just want to, wash your hands of that and say, okay, it's not an issue. We have this, we have a universal translator. We have this fish we shove in our ear. We have something we have our trusty towel. We have,
Yeah.
something in our inventory, something that's kind of a piece of equipment we all carry around that just removes this problem, removes this question. I think we kind of wash our hands of that one a lot, because even
Mm.
in a fantasy campaign, I mean, sometimes we pay attention to the fact that goblins only speak goblin.
Yeah.
You have the dungeon master saying, well, who speaks goblin? And then they make
Yeah.
some kind of like, "Ah, rah, rah, rah," voice
Yeah.
to simulate the goblin. But I think it's the challenges they face, in terms of space travel.
Yeah.
Is faster than light technology easily available? Is it simple to use? Do you just basically plug in some coordinates and, next thing you know, you pop into a new solar system? Do you have to worry about finding a jump gate? And that's the
Yeah.
only way. And if you don't have a jump gate, you're trapped, in the solar system. Do you have to worry about fuel? Do you have to
Mm.
recharge your dilithium crystals every now and then, or do you have to get more of the space juice that powers your drive? Do you have a magic blue police box, that can just take you
Yes.
anywhere and then just breaks whenever it's plot convenient? It's that thing that, if it's going to become a challenge to the player characters, is it something that's what you want at element? And even just in technology in general, like what happens to you, what you say, that scenario that they go to this alien planet and they don't have the right life support systems, or they don't have the environment suits that will protect them. Do they just abort that adventure and have to
Mm.
go, somewhere else and purchase it? Or do they have to find a workaround, to deal with it? I think technology can be a fantastic, it's like the real world. Technology can
Yeah.
be an absolute blessing. It can be something that's absolutely helps us in so many ways, but can just as much be a big pain in the butt. It
Yeah.
can introduce problems that we didn't realize we had to deal with. It can make things so easy that we don't know how to deal with those challenges when they really come up. So I think, it's great to have that blaster pistol. It's great to have that, teleport device on your ship that can beam you down to the planet, make things easier. But then the other great side of that is what happens when you take that away.
Yeah.
Think of how many Star Trek stories, deal with the fact that the transporter is broken and they're stuck in this hostile alien world. And how are they going to do it while Scotty works his magic, to try to fix the transporter? How are they going to survive and deal with that? Sometimes that's the fun thing about introducing the technology. What happens if that babblefish gets knocked out of your ear and you're
Yes.
surrounded by aliens that you have no way of communicating with? Then you have to figure out, you have to use your brain. It's a great challenge because it's not just combat. It's not just, space fighters, blasting missiles and, energy beams at each other. It's really a challenge for the players and to come up with inventive solutions. So
And I was just thinking there about, if the universal translator actually gets it wrong,
mhm.
and you're sort of like you're assuming that you're actually making a peace treaty with the aliens, but
Yes.
there's been something else, and
Yeah, you tell the alien overlord that, you think you're telling him that we come in peace, but you tell him that his mother smells like fish.
yes,
So
exactly, and
yeah.
how wonderful that be. Well, one of the things I really struggle about, and faster than light travel is a classic example, is that I start thinking, yes, we'll, starships can jump.
Hmm.
And then I sort of like think, okay, then, so how is that happening? What do I need for that? What's the fuel for that? How much does it cost? Where do you get it from? And I end up just going round in,
Yeah.
down a spiral or down a rabbit hole that I get to one point and I'm just thinking, sorry, where did I start here?
Yeah.
What's my starting?
Well,
Do you have any advice for that?
I think that's my question about what you want the campaign to be about. I think personally, I would love a campaign where, you're the scrappy traders. Traveler is a great example of that, where a lot of times what you are is you're a free trader that's out there with your, crappy ship that you barely are keeping together. You're scraping together credits to buy fuel so you can jump to the next planet to take the cargo that you have there. And, Firefly was like that too, where they're kind of was always in the back foot, when it comes to a lot of things. And I think that can be fun, where if you have the right kind of group and that's the kind of thing that interests, where they are the ones who are just barely making it by, oh crap, we're trapped on this planet right now because we don't have enough money. How are we gonna, are we gonna go, rob a bank? Or are we gonna go, do all these? I think even in Elevation, there's a whole thing I have in there where there's a ship part that you need, and there's a lot of choices about how to get the money for that ship part that can lead to a lot of different opportunities. Some of them involve crime, some of them involve just doing dirty jobs around the community, and that could be a fun thing.
Yeah.
But again, if that's not what you're playing, if your players, if you're playing you're designing a Firefly campaign and they want to play Star Trek,
yes,
it's not going to mesh. They're not going to.
It's not going to work.
They don't care about the fuel for the hyperdrive. They don't care about how many light years is going to be to here. The Star Wars parsecs, which interesting, but it's really the whole thing where you have to decide on that tone, and that doesn't mean you can't introduce that as a one-off. They've had that hyperdrive and they've never had to worry about it the entire campaign. They just hit the button and they jump here, they jump there, they head through the wormhole. They the jump gate always works, and then you have the session where it doesn't. Yeah, they have to what we talked about before, that you have to scramble and you have to come up with creative solutions and you have to figure out a way to figure out how to deal with this problem. And that could be something too, where you can introduce the technology and you can make them so comfortable with it. What happens when the technology doesn't work? Like you said, even with the translator, what happens when the translator doesn't work? What happens when you can't jump out of the hostile system? There's that whole thing in Empire Strikes Back where the Millennium Falcon's hyperdrive doesn't work and they're trying to get away from the Empire, and they're going into the asteroid field and they're doing this and they have to make their way to eventually to Bespin. And that whole complication happened because the hyperdrive was broken, and that led to a lot of adventures.
There's so many possibilities when in a sci-fi campaign. I love them. And I think I've GM'd fantasy for a long time. And it almost like, I think sci-fi campaigns are scary, because they're so vast, but also really enjoyable. There's so much potential there.
Well, think of Doctor Who's a great example of that. Doctor Who has epic space battles. Doctor Who has evil villains. You have the Daleks, you have the Cybermen. Doctor Who has a lot of stories about historical instances, a lot of personal stories, a lot of small stories. It's I think the thing that's intimidating about running science fiction is that it literally can be anything. In terms of fantasy, there's always archetypes that we take from. A lot of Tolkien bleeds its way into most people's fantasy settings. In terms of horror stories, we might have specific genres or things that we might have post-apocalyptic zombies stories, we might have vampires, we might have werewolves, we might have human horror, but it still feels a little more grounded. It still feels something that it's a smaller scope. But with science fiction, you literally can do anything. The sky's the limit in terms of what you can do. And yes, if you're doing a hard science fiction campaign, you're going to have probably a lot more strict rules about how things operate, and there might be more political elements to it, and there might be, technology is not a simple thing, that kind of, it's limited. Aliens, it has a good example that, a lot of times they do hibernation, they do, sleep between travel because they just don't have the type of hyperdrives that can just get them instantaneously somewhere. So, but
and that's quite a nice. I quite like that. Having to go into suspended animation for a period of time, because then again that opens up another possible story arc when you come out too early or something breaks.
Or like something like Interstellar, where you come out and decades have passed by, since you went in, and or even Ripley in Aliens, that she left to go on this simple, job, and then came back, and her daughter is a woman grown up.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's one of those things that, it's that itself can lead to really great drama and character stories. So
I haven't watched Interstellar, but the students that I work with keep telling me to watch it. Interstellar and Tenant, and I've watched Tenant, which is really sort of like a time film, back and forth. But Interstellar's still on the list. But one of the go for it.
All I was going to say is that itself, time travel, when you're talking about things like faster than light, time travel is science fiction, but it opens up so many other doors as far as, ripple effects, the butterfly effect, all these different things that can happen. Yeah. And that can lead to a ton of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, it's just interesting, about all these different things you can do with science fiction.
So we've mentioned some of the classic galaxies or universes, and we've talked about like Star Trek and Star Wars, and they often have like a big corporation, like the Federation, and we have the Empire in Star Wars. Is that something that I should be thinking about, and almost like getting this major opposing faction? Or
I think it's good because I think for a lot of us in role-playing games, we like a villain. We like, when you see these people coming, you're like, oh no, this is trouble. When you see the white armor of a stormtrooper, it's not a good situation. And that, obviously goes back to real world things, and there's a lot of influence as far as that, the evil empires, unfortunately we've dealt with in the real world throughout our history too. But it's a very telling thing. But I think it again depends on that scope of the story. Is, it can be good to have that evil corporation that when they show up, the players kind of, know they need to be on guard, that they know they need to worry about that, or that they want to oppose, rebel against. If you've watched, the very excellent Andor, and they really dive into the depths of how the empire functions and how the rebellion was built. It shows you, the real world evil of this fictional villain, and I think that is interesting, and it gives them someone to root for, and sometimes it gives them someone just to feel happy about going up and punching in the jaw, or shooting it out with their blasters, or an evil space empire of aliens, that if is there an antagonistic species of aliens bent on conquest, and I think we sometimes like having that, especially if you're doing a more action oriented campaign, or you want to inject some action to your campaign. Having that villain can just be a ready source of that, that it's like, oh, the empire has shown up, so we need to figure out what they're doing and stop whatever they're doing, because it's not going to be a good thing. And
this is all making so much sense for me, by the way. I was trying to remember the opposing force are in Blake 7, which is my all-time. I don't know whether or not it screened in America.
I don't know that one.
But it was actually called the Terran Federation. This is it's a long time ago, Blake 7, but it's something that I was brought up with. And then I don't. Do you know the Starseed Cycle by Kyle West?
I do not. So that one.
Yeah, well, they have an opposing force called the Swarmers, which every now and again attack the galaxies, or the and I was just thinking about the opposing force like the Borg in Star Trek and things like that, and which is really nice.
Well, and you can even kind of do those stories where you flip that. Think of Starship Troopers, where both the movie and the book, where there's kind of the question about who is the bad guy in terms of that. That it can be something where the alienness of a species makes us automatically think that they're the opposition,
Yeah.
and they might think the same of us. And then is it really something where there is, you know, or you can go, you can go Space Cthulhu, and
Yeah.
the alien entities are just so beyond what we can even fathom, and we are just inconsequential bugs, and how
Yeah.
do you deal with that? That the idea of that cosmic horror in the cosmos, that can be an interesting element to introduce. And even Star Trek did that to a degree, with like the Qs and these
Yes.
ultra powerful godlike aliens
I've
who,
forgotten about cues. Yeah.
yeah, and that was very common for them to do that with some kind of vastly overpowered cosmic entity that they would have to deal with. And it wasn't something you could just shoot with a phaser. It was something that you had to outwit, or you had to, you know, negotiate with. And that too can be something, even with a giant corporation or an empire, it goes back to that idea of scale. And going back to
Mm.
Andor, I think that's what it illustrated very well, is the idea that you kind of get to that point of, can we defeat this thing?
Mm.
Is it beyond our ability to deal with? I think in, Elevation, for example, we have the Cipher, corporation,
Yes.
that is a vast, like, Cipher Corp is this massive, vast, conglomerate that has near limitless funding. It's got genetically engineered troops that it sends out. It pretty much is just your typical evil
Yeah.
corporation. That
100%. Yeah.
greed and is motivating everything they do, and they don't really care about anything else except for their own profit margins. And, as a scrappy band of adventurers, how are you going to take down the evil corporation?
Mm.
You know, or are you just going to hurt them every now and then? Do little
Or
things here and there. And
or are you actually working for them?
yes, what if you
You're,
are part of that?
and then that brings in the role playing possibilities when
Mhm.
you're suddenly ordered to do something that fundamentally, or according to your values, you
Yeah.
think is wrong.
Well, think of from the sequel trilogy for Star Wars, like Finn, who
Yeah.
was a stormtrooper, but then,
Yes.
wasn't a great stormtrooper, and that's probably why he ended up becoming a hero. But
Mm.
you're right. That's an interesting question too. What if you are part of the wrong side of the conflict? Do you stay with it? Or
Mm.
do you find ways to justify it in your own mind, or do you start finding ways outside of the corporation, or find ways to leave it, or find ways to get out of the empire? So,
Is it?
and
I
that, like, oh,
No, go for it.
I was gonna say that just makes it a much more personal story. That
Yeah.
can add a lot of like role playing elements to a game.
I'm actually watching the first season of Andor,
Mhm.
only because the second season's come out, and I thought, well, I'm going to start watching it. But their their idea for that prison,
Mhm.
that they can electrocute the floor, I
Mhm.
just thought that is so good. It's
Yeah.
I do worry sometimes about people's creative minds coming up with these things and
Yeah.
how they're thinking, which it could be scary.
Well, and it's interesting because, like I said, that it's very much for any of us, because we're telling
Mm,
personal stories for our friends. We're telling personal stories for people that we know. We're not writing something that we're publishing for the most part. And it's something to entertain us, to
mm,
enthrall us. It's something to be a nice diversion, from the real world sometimes. And that's why I think it's okay, with your personal games, to take the things that you find from sources like that. You're running your game and they end up in a prison with electrified floors,
yes.
because, and somebody inevitably will say, oh yeah, like Andor. But it's good because it's familiar to them. It's something that makes them, oh, okay. It evokes something in them
Yes.
because it is a comfortable, familiar thing. And it's a great thing to do that, because you're right. Any type of role playing story that you're trying to run, to me, being the games master of any game is the hardest job, because
Yeah.
you do have to come up with an entire universe,
Mm.
You have to, yeah, you can set it in someone else's universe. The good examples, West Endgame Star Wars, the classic Star Wars RPG, which produced literally a mountain of
Mm.
supplements. I remember back in the day, I would collect them diligently. If it would break down species, break down the entire Death Star, including like every level of it.
Yes.
It would, which was interesting to me because it turns out that Lucasfilm took a lot of that information when they were coming back to do the prequels, because they basically didn't have to do the work. Someone already did a lot of the work for them. A lot of the species names that we use for, Star Wars species came from those games, not from
Wow. Yeah.
Lucas. But you can play in someone else's sandbox and tell your own story, but we can also use that sandbox as an influence for our own, because it's hard. It's hard to come up with all this stuff.
Mm. And I think what always worries me is what you were saying before is when the players just sort of like think, oh, this is exactly like the Empire, and whether or not they come to the campaign almost like looking for original ideas, So would you, I mean, would you take a whole system like Star Wars and play it as that theme, or do you recommend
Yes.
taking little bits?
I think it really is about what you and your players want. I mean, some of us like to do that. I have played many campaigns as a player and a game master in Star Wars, using the various systems, that have come up. And, our own beloved Mythras works great for Star Wars. But, I also have told my own stories, because, and they've definitely been influenced by the kind of science fiction that I've enjoyed and that I, devour, because that's what I like. And for a lot of other people, that's the same thing. When you tell a story of like a science fantasy type story like Star Wars, people know what to expect, and it kind of influences their characters. It kind of influences their way they play the game. If you're doing more of a horror Dead Space type story, that's going to influence how they approach things. They're not going to be so cavalier about running out with their guns and start shooting everything that moves. They're going to have to be a little more fearful and cautious about things. If you're doing a cyberpunk story, I had a good friend who ran a great Shadowrun campaign, and we were just mercenary crooks. And it was just week to week of what job do we have to pull, and what trouble do we get in. And that was great. We never left the city, but we really had a fun time. And I think that's just it. If you work out all the details, you come up with what style and genre you want to emulate, you come up with, answer the questions about aliens, or get your players' input, which I'm always a big advocate of, is, it's not just the game master's job to build the world. If you've got creative people around you, have them help. I've had a lot of campaign worlds where I'll just say, where are you from? And they're like, well, what cities are available? I'm like, I don't know. Tell me. What cities are available? I want to play an alien. Okay, what kind of alien do you want to play? Well, what races are available? I don't know. Tell me.
Yeah, tell me.
And then we can build. And I think sometimes even as a player, that's a fun thing, because you do genuinely feel like you're having your own part of this world. That's the one downside for some players about playing in someone else's sandbox, is when you play Star Wars, we know what happens. We know that, ultimately Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Princess Leia and Chewbacca all, were these great heroes, that the Death Stars were destroyed. The Empire was kind of taken down, but if you go by Mandalorian, and eventually Force Awakens and the sequel movies, the Empire just kind of just changed their helmet design slightly. But it can be hard because what's going on. I know, I think it's Modifius has the Aliens RPG, or there's Mothership, where there's options to play in those type of sandboxes too. But again, what's going to happen, in those stories. And that's sometimes why it is fun to build your own, because, you see that alien pod, or you see that person with the face hugger, the dead face hugger attached to their face. And what's going to happen as a player, what's going to happen.
You
you
know
you
where
see
it's going. Yeah.
those 3 dot laser sights, and you hear that like clicking noise from the, weird camouflaged area off in the jungle, and it's like, oh crap, there's a predator.
Yeah.
It's that thing where if you play in some of the sandbox, most of us have seen the movies, we've read the books, we've read the comics. So I think it's a harder task, but I think sometimes it is. And that's, like I said, it's fun to build your own world, even though it is
Yes.
intimidating. It's fun to involve your players in that world building.
I think this has been so helpful. And I've got a series of questions now in my mind that I need to think about. It's almost like I feel that will give me the basis to build my world on, and if those are quite steadfast, then everything will be built up really well, because I've got those core, and I think that'll be good for players as well, who understand the basis of the universe.
And going back to what you initially were talking about, like, I think the thing to keep in mind when we're doing it is the galaxy is only as big as you make it. So, that thing where when you feel intimidated, take it from the macro scale and shrink it down to the micro a little bit more.
Down.
And then you find that it's not really that vast. It's just as vast as you want it to be, and as your players decide to make it. But ultimately, it's just a series of adventures.
Before we finish up, I think I've been reading Elevation. So tell us what Elevation is. What is it, and how does that work with M Space?
Elevation, Clarence was very generous to let me kind of build my own sandbox. And as I said at the beginning, it's kind of a mishmash of a few different things that I wrote, a few different ideas I had based on science fiction I consumed. Ultimately, it's the story of the organization Elevation, that at one time was a very powerful, well-funded space peacekeeping organization. That their goal was to go out into the galaxy, and in this galaxy, new species are very lucrative. So if you discover a species that has not been already discovered, you register it with a species called the Rajolans. They have a database, and then if you're the one who made first contact with that species, you get a percentage of their trade for a certain period of time.
Nice.
Like you get a fraction of a percentage, but when you're talking about billions and trillions of credits, it's quite a valuable thing.
A bit, yeah.
So Elevation kind of started as an organization that did not want to have corporations and other entities that would take advantage of the situation and these species, and kind of be the one to make a proper first contact, introduce them into the galaxy the right way, not have them be exploited or taken advantage of. And that worked. They discovered a species called the Gress, and they helped them, and it funded their organization for quite some time. But when the campaign starts, things did not go as planned. They never found another species. The well dried up. The founder disappeared. And his granddaughter is the one who's kind of been handed what remains of the organization, is trying to keep it together. And the idea was the player characters, throughout the course of this campaign that's in the book, would hopefully find another species, make first contact, and kind of lift Elevation back up to where it was. Nice. So they can continue their good work. So that's the whole basis. Like I said, the idea was essentially what happened to the Federation ran out of money. So it's the same ideals and goals, that the benevolent goals that like the Federation is supposed to represent. But, in this galaxy, it just didn't work out as they planned. So that's the story.
Yeah. And I think there's 2 books. Is that right? Is there
there's an introductory adventure, which is free. I'll drive through RPG. And there is also the main core Elevation book, which details the setting, the different species that are involved in it. It has, like I said, a short campaign with several adventures, which I've never done this before, but there's an entire sequence of a very stressful bureaucratic challenge. So
very good.
It also has kind of a general bestiary, I would call it,
Mm.
of kind of more generic template of enemies, which can be used in any M-space game. It's got a couple generic starfighters and ships, which are pre-made, so that can be adapted for that, or it can be taken wholesale and plugged in wherever else, plus some new equipment and other things as well.
Mm.
So.
I must admit, I love the writing style of when they're describing the company, what it was like, and then that person says, well, we did start off with this number of starships, but now we're down to, and that one doesn't work very well. You know, I thought that was genius.
Thank you.
It's so good to read.
Well, it goes back to what we said too, like when you get so reliant on the technology, what happens when the technology is not that great? And you know, and that was part of the whole theme too, is like, you know, when they had their fleet of ships, they were the most state of the art, you know, top of the line exploration vessels. And this is, you know, 40 years on, and now they're outdated. I mean, think, you know, how you get a new iPhone every year. You know, think of how it would be when we actually have starships.
Yes.
Oh, this is the Star Seeker 16. I'm sorry, your Star Seeker 15 is now outdated, and
now outdated. Hard luck.
We're not going to do any more software updates on it.
Yeah, we're no longer supporting that model anymore.
Yeah. So,
thank you so much for taking some time out.
I always appreciate talking.
Yeah, and it's been absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And that's it. Another episode of Mythras Matters completed. Don't forget you can check out all my content by following my YouTube channel and the campaign areas of World Anvil. You can become members of the orders on both my Patreon and Ko-fi pages, where there are a number of perks. Links in the show note. I really appreciate your support, and do check out the Discord and the Tapper Talk forums. There are great people there sharing their ideas within discussions. So until next time, have a great month of gaming, and I will chat to you all again in August. Until then, I hope all your post rolls succeed and provide you with a well-deserved special. Thanks for listening, everyone. See ya. Bye. The content of this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license, so please give appropriate credit if you are sharing or copying any part of this podcast. Thank you. If you are still listening, I tried a new microphone with this episode. In the past, people have been able to hear a high-pitched noise throughout the podcast. I can't see it on the waveform, so please let me know if it was there, and if it was, sorry for the whistling throughout the episode. See ya. Bye.